Okay, this is Drama 203, Section 1, and today I will be talking about Acts 4 and 5 of Shakespeare's Richard III, a play that we've been looking at in our recent synchronous lectures. We went through Acts 1 to 3. I also talked about some of the relevant theatrical and political context for this play. In our last lecture, I spoke at length about the character of the Machiavel, who was inspired by the Italian Renaissance humanist, scholar, controversialist, writer Niccolo Machiavelli. Also talked about Richard Burbage, who was perhaps Shakespeare's greatest collaborator. Richard Burbage played the lead roles in Shakespeare's plays, beginning with this play, Richard III, which was first staged either at the end of 1591 or the early part of 1592 by the playing company known as Lord Strange's Men. They most likely performed the play at James Burbage's Theatre in the Shoreditch district of London. Well, before I get back into Richard III, I want to say a few things about a playwright I talked about in my lecture on ancient Roman theater. And that playwright is Seneca. Here's the latest edition of Seneca from the Oxford World Classics, a great translation by Emily Watson. And you'll remember from my lecture on ancient Roman theater, Seneca was Lucius Aeneas Seneca. He lived between 4 BCE and 65 CE. And in addition to being a playwright, he was a very famous philosopher and politician in ancient Rome. He served under the infamous Emperor Nero, who eventually forced Seneca to commit suicide. And you'll also remember from my lecture on ancient Roman theater that Seneca's plays adopt and adapt the plots of Greek tragedies, particularly the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides. There are, however, significant differences between the source material and Seneca's reworkings. The role of the chorus is minimized in Seneca, and there is far less emphasis on the gods. Most notably, much of the violence reported by messengers in Greek tragedy is depicted by Seneca in all its gore. Many scholars have argued that Seneca's plays are examples of closet dramas. Closet meaning they were never meant to be performed. Instead, they were recited in public gatherings. Well, when we get to the early modern period, the period in European history that begins around the year 1500, we find that the early modern playwrights, the early modern literary critics considered Seneca the prime model for writing tragedy. The first printed edition of Seneca's tragedies was published in Verona, Italy in 1474. And by the 16th century, there were over 50 printings of various collected editions of Seneca's plays. It was in 1559 that Jasper Heywood translated one of Seneca's tragedies into English. In the next few years, he did the same with two other Senecan tragedies. And by 1581, another English writer, Thomas Newton, edited and collected together a collection of Seneca's works. That collection was titled 10 Tragedies. 10 tragedies, because even though Seneca wrote only 9 surviving tragedies, this edition included a play that was falsely attributed to Seneca. The translators of 10 tragedies were Heywood, Alexander Neville, John Studley, Thomas Noose, all Renaissance humanist scholars, some of them involved in politics, some of them involved in the church, some involved in both. And they translated Seneca to English, with the result being this collection that proved enormously influential in the early modern period. Well, we know that the very first recorded performance of Seneca in England was at Cambridge University in 1551. A group of students performed in Latin Seneca's version of Euripides' Trojan Women. It's important to point out that ancient Greek plays were almost unknown to English playwrights. There was one translation into English of a Greek play. Thomas Watson in the early 1580s translated Sophocles' Antigone. But beyond that one translation, the writers, the scholars, the critics, the theoreticians knew the Greek tragedies through Seneca's adaptations of those plays. Well, on the public stage, Thomas Kyd was the first great playwright to compose works inspired by Seneca. In 1587, 1588, Kyd wrote a play entitled The Spanish Tragedy. It was an immensely popular play, often considered the first great English tragedy. It's a bloody story of revenge that doesn't hide its debt to Seneca. The main character in this play is the Knight Marshal of Spain, a man named Hieronymo, who loses his son due to the duplicity of the Machiavel villain of the play, Lorenzo. And in the play, Hieronymo, as he goes on his quest for revenge that climaxes in this extremely bloody scene where tongues are bitten out and limbs are dismembered, Hieronymo quotes Seneca. And at one point, there's a very famous scene in the Spanish tragedy where Hieronymo walks on stage carrying a volume of Seneca's plays, the Latin version of Seneca's plays, which he quotes from. Well, it wasn't just the dark themes and the often brutal violence of Seneca's tragedies that appealed to the early modern playwrights. They also loved the language of Seneca, that extravagant, highly ornamented rhetoric. I quoted Emily Watson in my lecture on ancient Roman theater, and I'll cite this quote again. She writes of Seneca, excess is Seneca's subject as well as the primary characteristic of his plays. And really, the writers, starting with Kyd at the end of the 16th century, took the excess in Seneca even further than Seneca ever did. Well, there are many other elements of early modern tragedies that derive from Seneca, beyond the violence, the dark themes, and the excessive rhetoric. The five-act structure of early modern plays comes from Seneca, as well as the sententia. Sententia is a Latin word for moral maxims, brief moral sayings. You'll find a lot of sententia in the works of Kyd, Marlowe, Shakespeare, and their contemporaries. There's also this dialogue technique called stichomythia. Stichomythia refers to quick verbal exchanges between characters, full lines or half lines, where a line of dialogue picks up a word from the previous one and uses that word in a different sense. Stichomythia. The early modern playwrights borrowed this particular technique from Seneca, who himself had adapted it from the Greek works of Aeschylus and Sophocles. Three of Seneca's plays prominently feature ghosts, and it's due to Seneca's influence that ghosts appear in a number of early modern tragedies, starting with Kyd's Spanish Tragedy. Likewise, early modern playwrights took over from Seneca the use in his plays of prophecies, omens, and allusions to the Greco-Roman underworld. So anytime in a late 16th century English play you have characters uttering prophecies or heeding omens or discussing, the infernal underworld, this is the influence of Seneca. In 1589, the writer Thomas Nash, he was a pamphleteer. He wrote The Unfortunate Traveler, which is sort of the prototype to the English novel. He was sometime a playwright himself. Thomas Nash wrote mockingly of how contemporary writers of tragedies discovered, in his words, that English Seneca, this would be the 10 tragedies translated by Jasper Heywood and his friends, English Seneca, read by candlelight, yields many good sentences, moral sayings, handfuls of tragical speeches. And Nash's point is that the writers of English tragedy, such as Thomas Kyd, were just imitating Seneca. They were bad imitators of Seneca. And they'd soon find that they'd used up all of Seneca's plots and all of his famous speeches. Nash continues in his diatribe. Seneca let blood line by line and page by page at length must needs die to our stage. In other words, they're bleeding Seneca dry. They're using him so much. And it's true. The influence of Seneca is felt in so many ways in the plays of the late 16th century going into the early 17th century. In the words of Jessica Winston, the early modern playwrights looked to Seneca as a source of ideas, styles, techniques, and forms. They did so to enliven their plays and to enliven the English dramatic tradition. Well, Shakespeare would have first been exposed to Seneca as a boy at the King's School, the grammar school in Stratford, England. Shakespeare would have read Latin passages from Seneca's tragedies. Wouldn't have read the entire plays, but as part of the curriculum, he would have had to have come to understand and translate passages from Seneca's tragedies. And as Shakespeare grew older and moved to London and became part of the theatrical scene there, no doubt he would have read the English translations of Seneca. Likewise, he most certainly knew Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy. In 1598, the English author Francis Meres wrote this pamphlet about really the state of English arts and culture. And he mentioned Shakespeare in it. It's one of the first times Shakespeare is mentioned as being a playwright. In this work, Meres judged Shakespeare to be Seneca's equal in tragedy. And in fact, some of Shakespeare's earliest plays, such as Titus Andronicus and the play we're focusing on, Richard III, and some of Shakespeare's later plays, like Hamlet, King Lear, and Macbeth, really bespeak and demonstrate the influence that Seneca visited upon Shakespeare's works. So that's Seneca, and I'll be coming back to some of the points at which we see the Senecan influence in Shakespeare's Richard III. Before we go into Act 4, I just want to review the end of Act 3, which I discussed at the tail end of my last synchronous lecture. Act 3 has, or I should say the end of Act 3, in particular the scenes Act 3, Scene 5, and Act 3, Scene 7, present this wild political satire by Shakespeare. Because what we have at the end of Act 3 is Richard and his confederate, his ally, Buckingham, engaging in a public relations campaign. They're concocting this campaign to win the people to Richard's side. Because remember, by this point in the play, Richard's oldest brother, the reigning king, King Edward IV, has died. Richard got rid of the middle brother, George, Duke of Clarence, in that famous scene in the Tower of London in Act 1, Scene 4. And now there's these young princes. It's expected that with King Edward's death, his 13-year-old son, Prince Edward, will now become the King of England. And if something should happen to Prince Edward, then the younger son, uh, uh, Richard, Duke of York, who's about 8 years old in this story, he will become king. Of course, it's Richard's goal to get the crown. That's what he lives for, and that's what he's been killing for up until this point in the play. And he realizes as he makes his moves, he needs the people on his side. So we have this moment at the beginning, sorry, of Act 3, Scene 5. Let's just turn to that now. Like I say, I cited some of these passages at the end of my lecture last day. It's on page 78, and it's Richard talking to Buckingham. Richard says, "Come, cousin." This is the very beginning of the scene. "Come, cousin, canst thou quake and change thy color, murder thy breath in middle of word, and then again begin, have a pregnant pause as an actor would, and stop again as if you were distraught and mad with terror?" And Buckingham responds, "Tut, I can counterfeit. I can be like the deep tragedian, the greatest tragic actor. Speak and look back, and pry on every side. Tremble and start, peer at wagging of a straw, intending deep suspicion. Ghastly looks are at my service, like enforced smiles." So Richard is essentially saying here that politics is a kind of theater, and the successful politician has to be a great actor. It's all an act. It is, as Buckingham puts it, counterfeit. That's one of the key metaphors in this play, and perhaps one of the key insights by Shakespeare in this play, how uh, uh, politics is, in its own way, like theater. And we have a play here that is about role playing, right? Some characters in this play perform their roles badly. Some characters in this play, like Richard, at least in the first 2/3 of the play, perform their roles spectacularly. Well, as this sequence of action continues, Richard and Buckingham get the Mayor of London on their side, and Richard gives instructions to Buckingham. He says at line 75, allege the bastardy of Edward's children, the two young princes. At line 80 to 81, urge his, King Edward's, hateful luxury and bestial appetite in change of lust. So Richard is advocating what today would be called negative campaigning and character attacks. He even tells Buckingham, who is in a way his campaign manager and spin master, to suggest that Edward himself, the late king, was illegitimate. He adds at line 93, so now we're on page 81, he adds, "Yet touch this sparingly, as 'twere far off, because, my lord, you know my mother lives." So they'll say anything to get power. He will disgrace his own mother in order to get power, because that's what he wants. And how do you get power? You know how to use spin. And we see here that Richard and Buckingham are masters at spin. And in Act 3, Scene 7, they put their PR plan into effect. This is on page 83. And it's perhaps Richard's greatest acting performance. His audience here are the Mayor of London and the citizens of London. It's a play within the play, composed by Richard and with Buckingham playing in the way the spokesperson for the people, Richard assuming the role of the humble, devout Christian who has absolutely no interest in worldly power. We have this wonderful stage direction. This is at line 94 of Act 3, Scene 7. So this is on page 86. The stage direction reads, "Enter Richard aloft between two bishops." Religious figures in Shakespeare's Richard III do not come off very well at all. They're always bribed by whoever is in power. They never stand behind the morals that they so powerfully articulate in various scenes of this play. They're so easily bought off, as is the case with these two bishops. As I said in our last day's class, Richard would have been standing on the gallery that was above the stage in the theater. And this gallery would sometimes be used by musicians. Sometimes the wealthiest playgoers, the wealthiest aristocrats who would frequent these plays would buy a seat up in the gallery above the stage in order to be seen by the larger audience. And often it was the case that Shakespeare would integrate that upper gallery above the stage into his plays, as he does here. So here's Richard standing in the upper gallery, a bishop on either side, holding his prayer book in his hand, addressing the people of London. The mayor says at line 93, see where his grace stands, tween two clergymen, and Buckingham, playing this scene for all it's worth, says two props of virtue for a Christian prince, to stay him from the fall of vanity, and see a book of prayer in his hand, true ornaments to know a holy man, famous Plantagenet. This is the surname of the ruling family of England at this point in history. Famous Plantagenet, most gracious prince, lend favorable ear to our requests, and pardon us the interruption of thy devotion and right Christian zeal. So politicians then and now almost always portray themselves as men and women of religious faith. Richard is no exception. He plays it to the hilt. He insists that he doesn't want or deserve to be king. Line 152. Definitively thus I answer you, he says to the assembled audience. Your love deserves my thanks, but my desert, unmeritable, shuns your high request. But of course, this is all part of the act. There's this wonderful moment too in Act 3, Scene 7. This is page 90 at line 218. Buckingham says, come, citizen, zoons, I'll entreat no more. And this word zoons is sort of a profanity. It means God's wounds. And Richard interjects at this point, oh, do not swear, my lord of Buckingham. You know, he's so noble and pure and religious, he can't tolerate swearing in his presence. Again, it's all part of the act. And by the end of the scene, Buckingham has convinced Richard to assume the role of king. Richard responds at line 226. Cousin of Buckingham, and you sage grave men, since you will buckle fortune on my back to bear her burthen, whether I will or no, I must have patience to endure the load. But if black scandal or foul-faced reproach attend the sequel of your imposition, you know, if what you impose on me results in some terrible event, he says, your mere enforcement shall acquittance me. The fact that I do this reluctantly will acquit me from any blame, from all the impure blots and stains thereof. For God he knows, and you may partly see, how far I am from the desire thereof. So Richard is saying here, he'll accept the kingship only because they forced him to do it. It's a play within the play, a play staged by Richard and Buckingham to con the people into believing that Richard is something he is not, all to gain the power that they have been questing for through the first 2/3 of this tragedy. Richard and Buckingham's charade is outrageous, it's appalling, and quite brilliant. I've said in past classes that I think I consider, and a great many of his admirers consider Shakespeare a psychologist. He understood human psychology so well. But I think Shakespeare too was a political scientist. And that is very evident at the end of Act 3. You know, he's making points about how politics really works I mean, it's a cynical take on politics, but it's a take that I think is proven true in a number of situations over the centuries, including 15th century England, which Shakespeare is depicting in this play. Well, let's turn then to Act 4. Act 4 begins on page 92 of our Signet edition. And at the beginning of Act 4, we meet Lady Anne again. Remember, Lady Anne was the wife of Prince Edward of Lancaster. And when this play begins, her husband is dead, her father-in-law, King Henry VI, is dead, all at the hands of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the main character of this play. And Lady Anne hates him and curses him. And yet at the end of Act 1, Scene 2, somehow Richard has seduced her. When we meet Anne again in Act 4, Scene 1, we see that she is now regretful that she ever allowed Richard into her life, ever believed for a moment that he was truly sorry for what he had done, and that he was a bad boy who was going to turn good. In fact, in this scene, Anne wishes for her own death. We also have some foreshadowing in the dialogue by Anne. It's in her discussion with the Duchess of York, Richard's mother, and the former Queen Elizabeth. Anne mentions that Richard's sleep is troubled. This is at line 82. She describes to the other women, "For never yet 1 hour in his bed did I enjoy the golden dew of sleep, but with his timorous dreams was still awaked." So some foreshadowing by Shakespeare. Now, the reason these three women are on the stage together is that they want to visit the young princess. The young princess whom Richard has placed under his protection in the Tower of London. So when King Edward IV died, you have his heir, this young Prince Edward, nominally in charge, but the tradition is if it's a child king, you need a protector, a lord protector, and that is the duty that Richard has assumed for himself. So he's in Act 3, he arranges it so that he gets control of these two young princes and tells them for their own protection, they must stay in the Tower of London. Well, the women are here to visit the young princes, and Brackenbury, who is the lieutenant of the Tower, denies them entry. He denies them entry on Richard's orders. And we have this very telling moment. This is page 93. Lieutenant Brackenbury says to Queen Elizabeth, who's the mother of these two princes, says, "Right well, dear madame, by your patience I may not suffer you to visit them. The king hath strictly charged the contrary." And Elizabeth is quick to respond, "The king? Who is that?" And then Brackenbury corrects himself, "I mean the Lord Protector." It's at this point that the now widowed Queen Elizabeth begins to realize what's really going on. Behind the scenes, Richard has assumed power of the kingdom, right? Remember in Act 3, Scene 4, he got rid of Hastings. Hastings was sort of the one powerful aristocratic lord who would stand up for these young princes and would ensure that young Prince Edward assumed the throne after his father's death. And Hastings, they got rid of him, right? They falsely accused him, and before he could even go before a judge, the papers were written up condemning him to execution. So Elizabeth finally clues in to what's going on, and she is justifiably horrified and fearful for her children. And then Lord Stanley, bottom of page 93, shows up. And he says, "Let me meet you, ladies, 1 hour hence, and I'll salute your Grace of York as mother, the Duchess of York, and reverend looker-on of two fair queens." Then he turns to Anne. "Come, madame, you must straight to Westminster, there to be crowned Richard's royal queen." And now the truth is out. Richard is going to crown himself and assume the monarchy of England. What he has been his major goal throughout this play. what he has been living for, what he's been killing for. Well, that scene comes to an end after Queen Elizabeth, expresses her fears for her children, tells Dorset, go to Brittany, go to France to meet with Richmond. This is the first reference to sort of the antagonist in this play, Richard's great enemy, Richmond. And then we have Act 4, Scene 2. Act 4, Scene 2, Richard is now King Richard III, crowned at Westminster Palace. And what is he doing? He is making plans to kill his nephews, to kill the young princes, the most infamous crime attributed to Richard in the early modern history books. There's a lot of dispute by historians whether Richard truly was responsible for the disappearance of these young princes. But in Shakespeare's day, in the 16th century, about a century after all of this happened, it was taken as fact that Richard was behind their deaths. We have this line at line 18 in Act 4, Scene 2. And it's Richard talking to Buckingham. He says, shall I be plain? I wish the bastards dead, and I would have it suddenly performed. And even Buckingham at this point is repulsed. He says at line 23, say, have I, or sorry, this is Richard talking, say, have I thy consent that they shall die? And Buckingham is taken aback. Give me some little breath, some pause, dear Lord, before I positively speak in this. This isn't in the source material, Buckingham's reluctance. I think Shakespeare includes it as a way of emphasizing the fact that Richard has gone too far. He got rid of Clarence, his brother Clarence, who, as we know from the dream that Clarence describes at the beginning of that amazing scene, Act 1, Scene 4, that Clarence has a lot of blood on his hands. Clarence betrayed his own father-in-law. Clarence helped Richard murder Prince Edward of Lancaster. Clarence was a bad guy. We still feel sorry for, but he was a bad guy. Hastings is a fool, right? Hastings played power politics, and he played against someone who is much smarter than he is, and he died for it. But now Richard is targeting the kids, these two young princes, his own nephews, and even Buckingham is appalled. Well, it's in this scene that Richard also decides he must get rid of his wife, Anne, Lady Anne, and that he must marry his niece. And we have another one of Richard's soliloquies in Act 4, Scene 2. I won't quote the whole thing, but I'll start at line 59. So this is the bottom of page 98. And Richard says to us, the audience, remember this stage device of the soliloquy is so important in this play and in a great many other Shakespearean plays. The character alone on stage, uttering his or her thoughts aloud. And this is what Richard soliloquizes in Act 4, Scene 2. He says, I must be married to my brother's daughter, or else my kingdom stands on brittle glass. Murder her brothers and then marry her, on certain way of gain. But I am so far in blood that sin will pluck on sin. Tear-falling pity dwells not in this eye. So here Richard realizes there is no going back. And in fact, this line, so far in blood that sin will pluck on sin, that line is a reworking on Shakespeare's part of a line from a Senecan play, Seneca's adaptation of Agamemnon. Well, in Act 4, Richmond comes to the fore. I mentioned that Queen Elizabeth references Richmond in Act 4, Scene 1. And she sends Dorset, right? Her son from her first marriage. She tells him to flee to Brittany. Brittany is a region in northwest France, and that's where Richmond lives. And it's in Act 4, Scene 2 that we learn more about the origins of Richmond and his significance to this story and to Richard. Here's Richard speaking. This is at line 94. So now we're on page 100 of our text. And Richard is conferring with Buckingham. He says, I do remember me, at line 94, Henry VI did prophesy that Richmond should be king when Richmond was a little peevish boy. And then there's an exchange between the two of them, and you begin to get the sense that, oh, Buckingham and Richard are falling out, and that Richard has gotten tired of Buckingham. He's gotten from him everything that he can get. He's used this man as a means to aggrandizing himself. And then Richard's thoughts in this exchange with Buckingham turn back to Richmond. He says at line 103, when last I was at Exeter, the mayor in courtesy showed me the castle and called it Richmond, at which name I started because a bard of Ireland told me once I should not live long after I saw Richmond. So it's another prophecy, right? Another prophecy, another omen. This character, the Earl of Richmond, we find out that on his mother's side, he belongs to the House of Lancaster, right? There were these two parts of the royal family, the Plantagenet family in England, that undertook against one another the Wars of the Roses. The Yorks, and that's the line that our Richard, as well as Edward and the young princes, all belong to, and then the Lancasters. And the Lancasters were seemingly wiped out at the end of the Wars of the Roses. But there's this one remaining member, the Earl of Richmond, a Lancaster on his mother's side. On his father's side, he was Welsh. His father was Edmund Tudor, a Welsh nobleman. And so Richmond's name is in fact Henry Tudor, a very important name in English history. Well, before Richmond reaches England to face Richard, we learn in Act 4, Scene 3 of the slaughter of the young princes. Let's turn to Act 4, Scene 3. It's narrated in the early part by Tyrrell, who's been the man to whom Richard assigned the task of killing the young princes. And he says at line 10, it begins with actually a soliloquy by Tyrrell. And Tyrrell describes how the young princes died. They died girdling, embracing one another. This is at line 10, within their alabaster, marble white, innocent arms, with a prayer book on their pillow. And they were suffocated. The pathos here is intense. Tyrrell, again, the man who set up the murder, refers to it at line number 2 as the most arch, that is the most extreme deed of piteous massacre that ever yet this land was guilty of. And he goes on to state that the two men who actually carried out the murder, Dighton and Forrest, line 20, are gone with conscience and remorse. They could not speak. They're overcome by conscience. Remember, conscience is a key concept and a key theme in this play. Here's another set of characters that we never actually meet, we only hear of, who are overcome by a bad conscience. Well, in contrast to Tyrrell, Richard is delighted. He wants to hear every detail of the young prince's deaths. At line 31, he says, "Come to me, Tyrrell, soon, at after supper, when thou shalt tell the process of their death. Let me eat first before I hear every single detail of how you murdered my nephews." And in this same scene, he mentions almost in passing that Lady Anne, his queen, is dead, and that he now must marry his own niece. He must marry her before Richmond does, because he is, always thinking several moves ahead. He said, if Richmond raises an army and comes to England, one way to get the support of, you know, the lords who once supported me is if he forms a union with Queen Elizabeth, King Edward's widow, by marrying King Edward's daughter, who's also named Elizabeth. So Richard reasons, I must marry her first. Forget about the fact it's his own niece. Well, this leads into Act 4, Scene 4, which is, I think, one of the very best scenes in this play. And I hate any production of Richard III that cuts down this scene. There's a few productions of the play that cut it out altogether. Act 4, Scene 4 begins with Queen Margaret. Remember Queen Margaret. She's the play's main choral character, right? There is no chorus in this play, but there are several characters who serve the function of a chorus, none more so than Queen Margaret. And she begins Act 4, Scene 4 with a soliloquy. This is on page 104. She says, so now prosperity begins to mellow and drop into the rotten mouth of death. Here in these confines slyly have I lurked. We haven't seen her since Act 1, Scene 3. Here in these confines slyly have I lurked, to watch the waning of mine enemies. A dire induction am I witness to, and will to France, hoping the consequence will prove as bitter, black, and tragical. And remember, the real Queen Margaret from back in the history books, Shakespeare would have known this, had died long before the action depicted in this play. But Shakespeare had this idea, I'll bring her in the play to provide exposition, remind the playgoers about what happened before the events of the play. I'll include her in the play to remind the other characters of the sins of the Yorks, what they had to do to get the power they have. And I'll include her in the play to use her as a choral character, which is what he's doing in Act 4, Scene 4. She uses this term induction. Induction is a term used to describe the beginning of a play. And in fact, this scene begins, or I should say marks, the beginning of Richard's fall, right? He gets more and more power and eliminates more and more of his enemies through Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and then near the beginning of Act 4, he commits his worst crime. He has his own nephews murdered. And then in Act 4, Scene 4, his fall begins. There's also this reference in Margaret's soliloquy to changing seasons, the coming of autumn, which echoes Richard's soliloquy at the beginning of the play. This is the summer of our discontent, right? This is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by the son of York. So in a way, in Act 4, Scene 4, the play starts all over again. And in this first part of Act 4, Scene 4, the remaining female characters, Queen Margaret, Queen Elizabeth, and the Duchess of York, grieve their losses in lengthy speeches that are called lamentations. The scene is Shakespeare's invention. There's no parallel scene in Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, which was the main source for this play. It's Shakespeare's invention, but it was undoubtedly inspired by a scene from Seneca's Troades, Seneca's version of the Trojan women, where the women of defeated Troy wail the destruction of their city and the deaths of their husbands. So here he is, he's borrowing from Seneca. And I think through this scene, we begin to appreciate more fully the consequences of Richard's actions. Remember, early in the play, we see those actions to a large degree through his own subjective view. He's the character that has the ongoing conversation with us through his soliloquies, through his asides, making we, the audience, in a way, his co-conspirators. Well, now we get the other side of the story, and we see the real suffering that he has inflicted on these people, including his own family members. Margaret and Elizabeth, the two queens, argue who has the greater reason for tears. At line 116, Elizabeth seeks instruction from Margaret on how to curse. Remember, Margaret is so skilled at cursing out Richard and the rest of the Yorks back in Act 1, Scene 3. Well, here Elizabeth says, "O thou well skilled in curses, stay a while and teach me how to curse mine enemies." Picking it up at line 24, "My words are dull, O quicken them with thine." And Margaret responds at line 124, "Thy woes will make them sharp and pierce like music." So Queen Elizabeth, who begins this play, the powerful queen married to King Edward IV, Queen Elizabeth has ended up in virtually the same position of Queen Margaret. And here they are together on the stage, along with the Duchess of York. And when Richard enters, the Duchess will not be silenced, even though he tries to drown out her words with the drums of his troop. His mother curses him out in the harshest terms. This is at line 137. She says, "I, she that might have intercepted thee, Richard, by strangling thee in her accursed womb from all the slaughters wretch that thou hast done." I mean, they go over the deaths and the losses that they've had because of Richard. This is on page 105. Margaret, in this very ritualistic lamentation that again owes a great deal to Seneca. Line 40, "I had an Edward, Queen Margaret, till a Richard killed him." Queen Margaret says, "I had a husband till a Richard killed him. Thou hast an Edward till a Richard killed him. Thou hast a Richard till a Richard killed him," referring to Edward and Richard, the two young princes. And the Duchess of York said, "I had a Richard too, and that did kill him," and so on. Well, in this moment, we have the women calling him out, right? They will not be silenced. And before exiting the scene and exiting the play, the Duchess of York prophesizes her son's doom. Line 195, "Bloody thou art, bloody will be thy end." And here's a moment where finally someone seems to get the best of Richard in an exchange of words. Richard dominates all the other characters, not only physically, but verbally in the first three acts of this play. And here we see a change. Well, before Act 4, Scene 4 ends, we have another wooing scene. So again, the play is, in a way, going back to the beginning and retelling the same story, but in a different way, where Richard is the one who is on the losing end of things. And here's a wooing. We had a wooing scene in Act 1, Scene 2. We have another wooing scene in Act 4, Scene 4. And here, Richard is trying to convince Queen Elizabeth to allow him to marry her daughter, who is also named, confusingly, Elizabeth. Well, it's an exchange that includes a great deal of stichomythia. I talked about stichomythia, which was this device used by the Greek tragic writers, adapted by Seneca, and then subsequently adapted by the early modern playwrights. So this is at line 343 of Act 4, Scene 4. Very long scene. And as I say, I think one of the most important and best scenes in this play. Richard is talking to his sister-in-law, Elizabeth. He says, he says, how you convince your daughter to marry me. "Infer fair England's peace by this alliance," line 343. Elizabeth responds, "which she shall purchase with still lasting war." Richard, Tell her the king that may command entreats, Elizabeth, that at her hands which the king's king forbids, God. Richard, say she shall be a high and mighty queen, Elizabeth, to wail the title as her mother doth. Richard, say I will love her everlastingly, Elizabeth, but how long shall that title ever last? Richard, sweetly enforce unto her fair life's end, Elizabeth, but how long fairly shall her sweet life last? Richard, as long as heaven and nature lengthens it, Elizabeth, as long as hell and Richard likes it. So there we have Stichomythia, done, I think, extremely well in this exchange between Richard and Elizabeth, the second wooing scene in this play, where Richard attempts to get his second wife. He praises young Elizabeth. At line 205, he says she is virtuous and fair, royal and gracious. He first denies killing the young princes. He says, you speak as if I had slain my cousins. But then at line 238, he confesses, I did intend, of course, putting his own spin on it. I intend more good to you and yours than ever you or yours by me were harmed. And perversely, he proclaims his love for his niece, his romantic desire for his niece. Line 264, with my soul I love thy daughter. So he tries to employ the very same strategy he used with Anne in Act 1, Scene 2. Line 288, say that I did all this for love of her. Remember, he says that to Anne. I killed your husband, Prince Edward. I killed your father-in-law only to win your love. And as he did with Anne, he suggests to Elizabeth that he is repentant. This is at line 294. If I did take the kingdom from your sons to make amends, I will give it to your daughter. So he goes on, offering some Petrarchan cliches, the cliches of love poetry. Line 355. Say I, her sovereign, am her subject low, which is, again, a trope of the love poetry that Shakespeare often mocked in his own sonnets. And then he threatens at line 407. He says to Elizabeth, without her follows to myself and thee, herself, the land, and many a Christian soul, death, desolation, ruin, and decay. Well, then we get to line 418. And at line 418, Queen Elizabeth says, shall I be tempted of the devil thou? And it's at this moment that she seems to give in to Richard. And then so she exits the stage a few lines later, and Richard has a very brief soliloquy where he believes that he's won again. Line 431, relenting fool and shallow changing woman. Richard is a deep and profound misogynist from the first scene to the last scene. And he thinks he's got one over, Queen Elizabeth and all of womankind. He's tricked them. But we learn that Elizabeth only pretends to yield. She pretends to yield to Richard in order to gain time. There's this very brief scene, Act 4, Scene 5, that ends Act 4, where Stanley is talking to Lord Christopher and Christopher Urswick. And in that scene, we learn that Elizabeth has already promised her daughter to Richmond. And so Richard, the master deceiver, has been deceived, and he doesn't even realize it. So this wooing scene, Act 4, Scene 4, the second wooing scene in the play, is in fact a failed wooing scene. Following this failure that Richard still doesn't realize is a failure, we see that Richard is beginning to crack under the pressure. He has exchanges with the messengers. This happens between lines 432 and 456. So this is on page 121, where he gives contradictory and incomplete orders, a way of showing that his grasp on power is slipping away. Earlier, Richard is seducing people to his side. Now people are fleeing from him. The rebels multiply with the arrival of each messenger. And most significantly, he learns that Richmond has set sail from France, from Brittany, for England, with intentions to take the crown. And the end of the scene shows that it's still not over for Richard. And that's because Buckingham, who had raised up an army against Richard, has been caught. And it's at the beginning of Act 5 that we get Buckingham's final scene. So let's just turn to Act 5, Scene 1. And this is on page 127 in our text. It's a very short scene, but it winds down the narrative arc of sort of the second major villain of this play, the Duke of Buckingham. And he's defeated by Richard's forces and is sent to his death. He notes at line 25 of Act 5, Scene 1, page 128, "Thus Margaret's curse falls heavy on my neck. When he, quoth she, shall split thy heart with sorrow, remember Margaret was a prophetess." And it is the case that all of Queen Margaret's prophecies are realized by the end of the play. Well, the play makes clear that Richmond, who appears the first time in the next scene, Act 5, Scene 2, is on the side of the angels. We have Richmond take the stage, bottom of page 128, and we have him speaking to the Earl of Oxford, Sir Walter Blunt, the Earl of Pembroke, and a number of his other aristocratic allies. He says, "Fellows, in arms, and my most loving friends, bruised underneath the yoke of tyranny, thus far in the bowels of the land have we marched on without impediments." They've essentially invaded England, but no one is coming to fight them because Richard, as king, has alienated, just about all of the populace of England. And he says, "And here receive we from our father Stanley," the Earl of Derby, Thomas Stanley, married Richmond's mother after Richmond's father, Edmund Tudor, had died. "Lines of fair comfort and encouragement, the wretched, bloody, and usurping boar that spoiled your summer fields and fruitful vines, swills your warm blood like wash, and makes his trough in your emboweled bosoms. This foul swine," again, the animal imagery that is attached to Richard throughout the play, "this foul swine is now even in the center of this isle, near to the town of Leicester, as we learn. From Tamworth thither is but one day's march. In God's name, cheerly on, courageous friends, to reap the harvest of perpetual peace by this one bloody trial of sharp war. In God's name, march," he says. So Richmond is going to save the land from tyranny, the tyranny of the wretched, bloody, and usurping boar. The Earl of Oxford, in the next sequence of dialogue, says, "Every man's conscience is 1,000 men to fight against this guilty homicide." So I'll pause before moving on to the big scenes with Richard III and say a few things about this character, the Earl of Richmond. Well, the Earl of Richmond, Henry Tudor, was Queen Elizabeth's grandfather. Queen Elizabeth was the ruling monarch in Shakespeare's time when Shakespeare was writing this play. She'd assumed the throne in 1558. She was monarch until her death in 1603. So Richmond is Elizabeth's grandfather. And so to present the character of Richmond as anything but a noble hero could really lead to trouble for Shakespeare. And so we have this one-dimensional character, necessarily one-dimensional, who's introduced in the second scene of the final act. Likewise, Lord Stanley, Thomas Stanley, who emerges as a key supporting character in the final scenes of this play. He too had to be portrayed in a positive light. He was not only the stepfather of the Earl of Richmond, but the historical Lord Stanley was the great great grandfather of Ferdinando Stanley, Lord Strange, the Earl of Derby, and the patron of the Burbage Shakespeare Playing Company, Lord Strange's men. Remember that I mentioned 2 lectures ago that after 1572, in 1572, an act was passed by Parliament, the Vagabond Act, the Vagrant Act. And as a result of that piece of legislation, all playing companies in England had to have an aristocratic patron. They had to have a patron or they faced arrest and mutilation. And so here we have Shakespeare writing for Lord Strange's men. And because of the patronage systems of the day, Shakespeare presents Lord Stanley, the great-great-grandfather of Lord Strange, as this, again, one-dimensional heroic figure. Well, we get to Act 5, Scene 3. Act 5, Scene 3, I think, is the final lengthy scene of the play, and absolutely one of the best scenes. This scene contrasts Richard III with Richmond, the Earl of Richmond. On the eve of battle, Richard has a conference with his men, and he says to Radcliffe, this is at line 73. So now we're on page 132. He says, I have not the alacrity, the eagerness of spirit, nor cheer of mind that I was accustomed to have. Sit it down, is ink and paper ready? And he's writing out these documents to send to the aristocratic lords who have long backed the York family, who aren't returning their letters because they've abandoned Richard. So in Act 5, Scene 3, we have Richard now increasingly this diminished figure. The meter, the poetic meter of his lines at various points in Act 5, Scene 3, and in the scenes that follow, disintegrates. This Richard was so powerful in part because of his verbal skill. And now the lines of poetry aren't so poetic. Well, we then have a soliloquy from Richmond. And this soliloquy is on page 133, Richmond's only soliloquy in the play. And the soliloquy is a prayer that shows that his religion is not mere pretense, as it is the case with Richard. When Richmond is alone, he's as devout a soldier of God as he is when he's addressing his men. He is humble, pious, almost sickeningly good. He says at line 109 in his prayer, O thou whose captain I account myself, look on my forces with a gracious eye, put in their hands thy bruising irons of wrath, that they may crush down with a heavy fall the usurping helmets of our adversaries. Make us, he's asking God, make us thy ministers of chastisement, that we may praise thee in the victory. If we win, I won't take credit for it. It will be God's victory because we're on the side of the angels. To thee I do commend my watchful soul, ere I let fall the windows of mine eyes, sleeping and waking. Oh, defend me still. And that leads, as Richmond goes to bed, it leads to this scene where the ghosts take the stage from lines 118 to 177 of Act 1, Scene 3. We have the ghosts of Richard's 11 victims. It's a highly ceremonial sequence of action. Words and phrases are repeated throughout. We have the moment when the ghost of Prince Edward comes on the stage and says, let me sit on thy soul, turns to Richard, let me sit on thy soul tomorrow. Thinkest thou stabbest me in my prime of youth at Tewkesbury? Despair therefore and die. And then he turns to the sleeping Richmond. Be careful, Richmond, for the wrong souls of butchered princes fight on the, be cheerful, sorry, Richmond, for the wrong souls of butchered princes fight in thy behalf. King Richard's issue, Richmond, comfort thee. And so each of these ghosts come to the stage, and each of them say to Richard, despair and die, and pledges their support to Richmond. Even the Yorks support Richmond at this point. So it's this, as I say, a highly ceremonial scene. I think the playgoers in 1591, 1592 would have loved it. You know, these ghosts, these Senecan-like ghosts taking the stage. And I imagine it would have been staged with, Burbage as Richard III, maybe at one end of the stage, sleeping, lying there, and feigning sleep, and then the actor playing the Earl of Richmond, maybe at the other end of the platform stage, or maybe closer to the tiring house, also, lying on the stage, feigning sleep. And then each of these characters, many of whom we met early in the play before they were killed off, coming out offering their curses to Richard and their support to Richmond. Well, it's a nice piece of drama, I think, but my favorite moment in Act 5, Scene 3 comes next. And it's this shocking moment when we see Richard experience inner conflict. And this is on page 136. Richard awakens from his dream, and here he speaks in soliloquy. Bottom of page 136, line 178. Richard starteth up out of a dream. Give me another horse, bind up my wounds. Have mercy, Jesu. Soft, quiet. I did but dream. O coward conscience, how dost thou afflict me? The lights burn blue. It is now dead midnight. Cold, fearful drops stand on my trembling flesh. He's sweating. Why do I fear? Myself? There's none else by. Richard loves Richard. That is, I am I. Is there a murderer here? No. Yes, I am. Then fly. What? From myself? Great reason why. Lest I revenge. What? Myself upon myself? So here we have Shakespeare representing to us in this shattering, harrowing soliloquy, Richard's mind divided against itself, which I think is given further emphasis through these use of pronouns, right? Myself against myself, I am I, right? And he continues in this soliloquy, alack, I love myself. Wherefore? For what reason? For any good that I myself have done unto myself? Oh no. Alas, I rather hate myself, for hateful deeds committed by myself. I am a villain, yet I lie, I am not. Fool, of thyself speak well. Fool, do not flatter. So, for the first time in the entire play, Richard is critical of himself. The speech then presents what is the final, most shocking, and most memorable attack of conscience in the play. Richard says, my conscience hath 1,000 several tongues, and every tongue bringing a several tale, and every tale condemns me for a villain. So what a powerful image here, right? We have a metaphor, conscience imagined as a being with multiple tongues, all accusing him. And of course, throughout this play, we might have assumed, falsely assumed it turns out, that Richard doesn't have a conscience at all. Well, the soliloquy wraps up. Perjury in the highest degree, all several sins, all used in each degree, every kind of sin, from the least to the most wicked, throng to the bar, crying all, guilty, guilty. I shall despair. There is no creature loves me, and if I die, no soul will pity me. And wherefore should they? Since that I myself find in myself no pity to myself. So Richard analyzes his own mental processes, and he is overwhelmed, at least temporarily. He is overwhelmed by self-hatred and by desperation. Metaphorically, his own conscience has put him on trial. I mean, what a marvelous scene. A scene that fulfills one of Margaret's most bitter curses. This is from back in Act 1, Scene 3. The worm of conscience, Margaret says, still gnaw thy soul. Thy friends suspect for traitors, for thy dearest friends. You'll be suspicious of everybody. No sleep close up that deadly eye of thine, unless it be while some tormenting dream affrights thee with the hell of ugly devils. The final curse of Margaret comes true. And Shakespeare here demonstrates his mastery of technique to convey the conflict that Richard is experiencing within his mind and within his soul. Shakespeare uses rhetorical questions. Richard keeps questioning himself, self-contradiction, right? And interjections. Richard interrupting himself as this speech goes along, all to present this vivid and memorable picture of a tormented emotional state. I mean, this is an amazing soliloquy. And of course, as Shakespeare's career continued and wrote Hamlet, Othello, and Macbeth, and King Lear, he would write many more soliloquies that are all about emotional conflict, inner torment. And it's often in those soliloquies that the characters seem most real to us. You know, that's part of the Shakespearean magic. And in some respects, that's what he is the best at. Well, let's look at these final two scenes, however briefly, and in fact, they're brief scenes. Act 5, Scene 4, Act 5, Scene 5. These two scenes dramatize the Battle of Bosworth, which took place on August 22nd, 1485. And before Shakespeare presents the actual battle, he has two orations, that is, addresses to the soldiers, one given by Richmond, the other given by Richard. Richmond gives his oration first. This is at line 238. So this is on page 139. And in Richmond's oration, he emphasizes the morality of his cause. He says at line 241, God and our good cause fight upon our side. The prayers of holy saints and wrong souls. And then he continues at line 254, if you fight against God's enemy, God will in justice ward, will protect you as his soldiers. So it's a highly conventional speech. Richmond says precisely what an unambiguous hero would be expected to say. Shakespeare ended up making the Earl of Richmond an incredibly boring character. And as I said, he really had no choice. He had to present him as this one-dimensional heroic figure. Why? This is the Queen's grandfather. And, you know, all of the playing companies of Shakespeare's day aspired for that, the best gig of them all, which is to play at the Queen's court at Christmas time. So we have Richmond's speech. Then we have Richard's speech. And that speech begins at line 315 and ends at line 342. And this speech, in its vividness and ferocity, is by far the more memorable. At line 317, he says to his men, a sort of vagabond rascals and runaways, a scum of Britons, meaning from northwestern France, a scum of Britons and base lackey peasants, whom their overcloyed country vomits forth to desperate adventures and assured destruction. And then he goes on to use military slang. He says at line 333, if we be conquered, let men conquer us, and not these bastard Britons whom our fathers have in their own land beaten, bobbed, and thumped, and in record left them heirs of shame. Shall these enjoy our lands, lie with our wives, ravish our daughters? So very cleverly, Richard presents this battle as one against foreign invaders, and he exploits his soldiers' fears. So even though nothing has gone right for Richard, and his ferocious energy that he embodied earlier in the play seems to be sapping away, he still is this Machiavel who can push emotional buttons. And he's saying, if you don't agree with me and don't support me, you should still follow me because I'm better than these invaders who want to destroy our land. Well, as the Battle of Bosworth Field unfolds, Catesby, Richard's deputy, tells the men, this is in the next scene, Act 5, Scene 4, this is on page 143. Catesby tells his men and tells us, the audience, that as the battle is in pitch, the king enacts more wonders than a man daring and opposite to every danger. His horse is slain, and all on foot he fights, seeking for Richmond in the throat of death. So from his very first speech in the play, we know that Richard is a great soldier, a great warrior. So here at the very end of the play, he is doing what he loves best. And when Richard enters the stage in Act 5, Scene 4, he utters his most famous line twice. He enters the stage, this is at line 7, he says, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. And Catesby says, withdraw, my lord, I'll help you to a horse. Richard, slave, I've set my life upon a cast, and I will stand the hazard of the die. He's been a high stakes gambler. These are references to the game, dice throwing. He's been a high stakes gambler, and that's the way he's going to die. I think there be 6 Richmonds in the field, for I've slain, have I slain today, 5 have I slain today instead of him. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. So at this moment, he would offer everything he's lied and cheated and killed for. The crown, the kingdom that, at least until this moment, he's been ruling. He's ready to offer it all for a horse, right? Because to be unhorsed in a medieval battle pretty well means your imminent death. So a single line in this play communicates one of the play's main messages, a message articulated by the Earl of Hastings back in the 3rd act. Oh, the momentary grace of mortal man, right? You quest and you cheat and you lie to get earthly power, and it all betrays you in the end. And notice, it's all expressed in a single line, right? The other playwrights of Shakespeare's day would spend lengthy speech, expressing this idea. And I think, again, this is one of the areas where Shakespeare is the best. He can break it down to a single line. A horse, a kingdom for my horse. And that line expresses, where this character winds up. And at the same time, puts across one of the main ideas that is given expression in this play. Well, we have, as the final scene begins, Act 5, Scene 5, and this is on page 144, we have the stage directions that read as follows. Richard and Richmond meet, they fight. Richard is slain. And there would be an opportunity for Richard Burbage, playing Richard, to demonstrate his great ability with stage fighting. Richmond then says at line 2, the bloody dog is dead. And then we get a lot of moralizing from Richmond, and we're reminded that this is fairly a very one-dimensional, boring character. But the playgoers, with Richard's death, have now witnessed his rise and his fall. I think making for an extremely entertaining play, reminding us that villains can be irresistibly compelling. And I think that, that was one of Shakespeare's main goals, to entertain the audience, which I think he certainly does. This play has never left the stage. It was a popular play in its day. It's remained a popular play in every century since. I think there's, deeper meaning as well in this play. Shakespeare is showing us, giving us a lesson on politics. He is depicting for us what happens to a society when it falls under tyranny. And he's also showing us, the outer and inner workings of a megalomaniacal demagogue. And don't we, living in 2020, know a lot about demagogues? It's all here. It's all here in Richard III, one of Shakespeare's earliest and greatest plays. So as we leave Richard III, the last thing I want to talk about today is costuming. Costuming on the early modern stage. While the theaters in which Shakespeare worked had no lighting and had very minimal scenery, there was a great deal of attention paid to costuming. Costuming, like the poetic language, contributed significantly to creating the illusionary effect of these plays. Actors performed in clothing of the day. As far as we can tell, they didn't wear historical clothing specific to a given play. They wore contemporary clothing, the clothing of the Elizabethans. The costumes were in many cases lavish, elaborate, and glamorous. The writer Jonathan Bate has written the following. Bate has written that more money was in fact spent on the purchase of costumes than on the commissioning of scripts. The kings, dukes, and ladies in the plays would have looked impressively courtly, not least because their wardrobe consisted in part of the second-hand clothes of courtiers. Often, when aristocrats died, they would bequeath items of clothing to their servants, who would sell those items of clothing to the playing companies. And in fact, we have an inventory. Philip Henslowe, I mentioned Philip Henslowe. He was the owner and manager of the Rose Theatre, where the Admiral's Men, which was sort of the number 2 playing company of England during the latter part of the 16th century. They performed a lot of Christopher Marlowe's plays. And we have, from the papers of Henslowe, an inventory of his costumes. And that inventory includes numerous items of apparel in satin, taffeta, and cloth of gold. They're also listed cloaks, jerkins, which are the close-fitting jackets that men of that era wore, breeches and doublets of various colors, white, tawny, silver, red, black, green, yellow, many of them trimmed in silver lace. It's also funny that in this inventory of the costumes, Philip Henslowe writes a little note, "We can't find Henry V's cloak. Someone walked off with that cloak." So costume was so important. Gabriel Egan, another great theater historian of the early modern period, estimates that clothing stock could be worth more than the theater in which the plays were performed. So costuming, as I say, was essential to the illusion that these players created on stage as they told their stories, and that relates to something that's quite fascinating from medieval and early modern England. In these periods, medieval period, early modern period in Europe, there were these things called sumptuary laws. Sumptuary laws regulated the type of clothing that could be worn by the members of each social class. So, for example, silks, satins, and sables were officially restricted to gentry. If you were a working class person, if you were a yeoman and you wore this type of clothing, you could be fined, you could even be imprisoned. Sumptuary laws. They were laws set up to maintain the social hierarchy. And early modern European society was extremely hierarchical. Your clothes defined your social status. But because they operated with a license from the Queen, actors were exempt from the sumptuary laws, only within the theater. They couldn't wear their costumes outside the theater. But within the theater, commoners like Richard Burbage, the son of a carpenter turned actor, dressed as kings, right? Dressed as King Richard III in this wonderful Shakespearean play. And I think the sight of a commoner like Richard Burbage dressed as a king would elicit many different responses from playgoers. Many playgoers would have perhaps found it shocking and scandalous. Other playgoers might have found this sight thrilling, and still others liberating. So in the next play that we're going to look at, another Shakespearean play, Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, and that's going to be the subject of the next synchronous lecture. So I hope you begin reading that play. In that play, costume and disguise are absolutely central to the plot. So that's what we'll be looking at next day. We've now studied one of Shakespeare's greatest histories. Now we turn to one of his history plays, that is. Now we turn to one of his greatest romantic comedies. So we will leave it there for now.